I'm just gonna do the whole message like this. It's a new thing. Reality check, yeah. I was told that I look like a youth pastor today, which I shouldn't have even given you that image because now you're gonna totally agree with that. But it's kind of an insult because I've worked hard, you know. I feel like I pride myself on the fact that I'm kind of a pastor to people on the other end of the spectrum, and that makes me feel distinguished. You know what I mean? So don't get that out of your mind, okay? It's summer. You can wear sandals, you know. I want you to feel casual. But all right, let's just moving right along. We're in this series called Reality Check. And the question that we've been asking ourselves throughout this series is, what if reality is bigger than we often give it credit for, right? What if what we experience and what we perceive from day to day, there's actually so much more than that often our perspective, our scope is limited, right? And if we could open our minds to what reality is beyond what we think it is, what we get so attached to, perhaps it would create more room in our hearts for love, right? More understanding. See, I think that there's a connection between our capacity for things like gentleness, our capacity for things like wisdom. There's a connection between that and our openness, right? How loosely we hold our perspectives. See, friends, I think that there is something wonderful about people who have strong opinions, right? Strong beliefs. In some ways, now more than ever, it's an important time to know what you believe about things, right? And to hold those beliefs with a sense of passion and care. And at the same time, when we hold our perspectives with absolute certainty, right, we become unwilling to see what other people think. We become unwilling to see a scope of view outside of our own, and that limits our ability to experience reality. And so last week, we began talking about our inability to see fully based on the cognitive biases of our brains. And really what those are the blind spots of our thinking. And so today, we're going to be talking about the fact that if we are going to take a good, long look at reality with an open-hearted and humble perspective, what we might notice is that reality is not black and white, but it's something far more. Well, you might say, does that mean that reality is gray? See, gray is like a term that we often use when we're talking about nuance and complexity. But when I think about gray, as someone who lived in Seattle for 6 years, I think about the misery of 10 months of no sun, right? Or when I think of the color gray, I think of my cooking. And so the perspective that I want to take today is the idea that between black and white lies every color, right? The spectrum of all colors. And really today, the perspective that we're going to take is that reality is not black and white, but it is a spectrum. It is a range, that there is so much contained within reality. And to really start off our conversation, I want to turn to the Taoist teacher, Lao Tzu, who said this: "The truth is not always beautiful, nor beautiful words the truth. The wise man sees all in the spectrum, not in black and white." Friends, all of the reality that you and I can perceive with our senses exists on a spectrum or on a range, right? When it comes to sound, there is a range of the frequencies that you and I can hear and the frequencies that we can't, right? Color and light exists on a spectrum, right? Smell is actually even more complex than just a linear spectrum, because there's not only the spectrum of smell, but there are combinations between smells that can pretty much create endless possibilities. And for those of you who might have left your leftovers in the car overnight, you understand this. You understand that food plus time, it's a different combination, right? Not so pleasant. But science has helped us understand over time the limitations of what we think of as our own capacity, right? Such as the fact that the sounds that you and I as human beings can hear make up less than 20% of all sound. Or the fact that the smells that you and I can smell make up somewhere between 1% and 0.1% of all possible smells that we can smell. And when it comes to light, what we can perceive with our vision, well, that is less than 0.0035%. That's what we experience. 0.0035% of all possible light that's what we see. So just a small fraction, a tiny grain of sand compared to all that is out there, all that is possibly perceivable. And yet, we act like we know it all, right? We act like we've seen it all. And that makes us categorize reality in these really black and white ways. And so today's reality check is going to be becoming aware of the immensity of experiences that live outside of our own. See, for me, growing up within a evangelical Christian background, the faith system and the way that I understood it and the way that it was taught to me didn't have a lot of appreciation for the spectrum of life, for the variety of experiences that people might have, particularly when they come to faith. My experience of faith was a very in or out mentality, right? You're either with us or you're against us. You're either in the tribe or you're not, right? And actually, that really hinged upon how you answered one question. And maybe for you who grew up in different denominations, different forms of church out there, maybe the nature of that question was a little different. But in general, it was some version of, how do you see Jesus? Who is Jesus to you? Is Jesus your Lord and Savior? And the way that question was asked, at least to me, didn't hold a lot of nuance to it, right? There was no wondering, well, what does that mean, right? What does that actually mean in your life, in your unique lived experience? What would that mean to have Jesus in your heart? Or furthermore, how is that actually lived out in your life, right? Or maybe the nature of how you think about that question might change between the ages of 13 and the ages of, say, 60, right? It's a nuanced question that, in my experience, wasn't given a lot of nuance. And so in my subconscious, I think I started to question and really have trouble with this aspect of my faith. The sense that my eternal reality, my salvation, hinged upon my correct answer to a yes or no question. It really, I think, struck me and terrified me. And so I'd have these dreams around that time, I think kind of nightmares. And basically I was in line at heaven, and I would get to the front of the line, and I'd be asked a question. And it wasn't like a question about Jesus. It was some impossible riddle that makes no sense. Like if the elephant has wings, then, are its shoes made of leather, or something just really ridiculous. And I'd be freaking out. Like, I don't know. How do I answer this question? And that was the dream. It was just this terrifying feeling of uncertainty. And I look back, and what I think it was, at least one way to interpret it, is that there was something within my subconscious that was rejecting the sense that my place in the world, my place in the cosmos, my spiritual reality hinged upon a pass or fail way of looking at things, right? That maybe there was more than this binary reality that I had been handed. And so I think for many of us who have been on a journey of faith, that journey includes moving from a pass or fail, yes or no, in or out mentality into complexity, into nuance, right? It's almost like the move from black and white into color, right? And there's this wonderful clip that I'm about to show, and there's this moment in Australia in 1975 when all Australian television transitioned from black and white into color, and in that singular moment, they chose to use some kind of interesting images as a way of marking this major transition for this country. So I'm going to show this clip now.
Through the window! That filthy thing all over my new carpet! Look, it's filling the room! How are we going to breathe? Quick out for the wollongong here! I'll try and hold it down. There it is. Hey, look at me! I'm in colour! Come on in, it's lovely! I can't hold it on very long, Ross. Here it goes, Haber! Oh, what a beautiful room.
There's some inherent problems in trying to show a YouTube video from 1975, so I thank you for bearing with me. But basically, if you had a hard time telling what was going on, to mark that transition, they had this scene where color, like water filling the room, color began to fill the room, and from that moment on in Australian television, TV was in color. I guess if you had a color TV, right? But it reminds me of the experience that we have in our lives. That the embrace of nuance and complexity, the move from black and white to color, can often feel overwhelming at first. Maybe there's a bit of resistance, right? And then as it starts to overtake you, there's this embrace. And as he says at the end, what a beautiful room. Going from resisting and fighting it, I need to hold on, into acceptance. And that journey takes time. It takes courage to open our hearts up to nuance, to appreciate the full spectrum of life. Because it can feel really safe in a black and white world. It's a world that we're often in control of, or at least we think we're in control of. And it can feel dangerous to open up to all the complexity and nuance outside of the known. And yet, when we invite the color in, it does just that. It colors our world with more love, with more hope, right? With more connection. And we begin to celebrate experiences and perspectives that exist outside of our own experience, outside of the binaries of what we've been taught. This is why I think there's a lot of power for everybody in the trans and non-binary movements. Because what they are showing us is really confronting us with this question of why have we turned something or things such as sexuality and gender, these really complex things, why have we stuck them into our binaries instead of allowing them to live on a spectrum? Why do we take something like sexuality, which is so mysterious and sacred and divine, and try to fit it in our human categories and boxes? How about another spectrum that holds a lot of potential for us all, whether or not we feel like we live on this spectrum? And this is the autism spectrum. Would you believe that we did not have the term autism spectrum in our vocabulary until 1988? 1988, that's less than 40 years, right? When Lorna Wing, British psychiatrist, coined the term autism spectrum. Which means that before then, autism was seen as a singular condition that you either had or you didn't, right? So how long did people exist within varying forms of neurodivergence, not having the language to understand themselves, to understand the ones that they love, right? And how helpful has it been now that we have this language, that people can see themselves on this spectrum and have tools and resources for understanding the way that their brain works in a very unique and special way. So this language, this spectrum language, it's really powerful for us for a couple reasons. One, it helps us understand and recognize and appreciate our unique personhood, the way that you and I show up in a unique way in this world, right? If we can recognize that we exist on spectrums, and there are many spectrums of life, right? Not just sexuality or cognitively, but spiritually, right? Physically, we have all these different ways that we show up on a spectrum, and it lets us realize that instead of, it's good or bad, the way I show up in the world is just good or bad, we can see, no, it's just on the spectrum, and there are always going to be varying degrees of experience. The second thing is when we can understand this, we also can have the humility to realize that our experience, and wherever you live on the spectrum, it's finite, right? There are always going to be experiences outside of your own on either side. Recently, a science journalist named Ed Yong wrote a book called An Immense World. And I want to thank Marlise for Marlise, my new friend, for recommending this book to me, because it's a beautiful book about how animals, of which we are included in that kingdom, there is a variety of experience in which different species can occupy the same space and yet experience totally different components of reality. So for example, you and I, right, and our senses, we have certain limits, and they are very different than insects and other mammals and so on and so forth. And so there is, in a sense, a particular bubble that you and I live in, right? And Ed Yong talks about this bubble, and he calls it, or he labels it as such. He says there is a wonderful word for this sensory bubble, Umwelt. Umwelt comes from the German word for environment. An Umwelt is specifically the part of those surroundings that an animal can sense and experience its perceptual world. A multitude of creatures could be standing in the same physical space and have completely different Umwelten. I'm really nailing my German today, so thank you. So think for a minute. You might be sitting on the couch, right, and your dog's there, and maybe a mosquito's there, and you don't even realize, right? So you, your dog, and mosquito, you're all occupying one space, and the TV's on, so you're engaging with the television. Your dog, nor the mosquito, has any idea what British Bake Off is, right? Like that's just you and your experience. Meanwhile, your dog perhaps is sensing dogs barking 2 blocks down that you can't even perceive with your own hearing. And then the mosquito, it's out for blood, right? It smells blood in ways that you or even the dog never could. And that's what it's focused on. That's what its Umwelt is built around. So different beings can occupy the same space and yet experience totally different layers of reality. One of my favorite examples of this, I think, is my favorite meme of all time. How dogs see road trips. This is a dog in clearly like a seat in a van, right? And you just have to imagine, like, we take it for granted, right? We go on road trips, we drive down the city, and we can just, all these things pass us by, and we know what we're looking at. We know what highways are and stoplights are. You have to imagine a dog is in a mystery world, right? And so I've always just, this has given me a lot of empathy towards my dog, or just appreciation for how blown away she is at just something as simple as a car ride. But it's this reminder that we can occupy the same space together and experience totally different layers of reality. This is true of many aspects of animal abilities, right? Fish have this capacity called electroreception, which means they can perceive electromagnetic fields, and it allows them to avoid predators. Insects can sense ultraviolet light that you and I have no idea about. Bats and dolphins can use echolocation, so they use sound to perceive their physical environment. Birds can perceive the magnetic field of the earth in ways that we don't even fully understand, but it impacts their migratory patterns, right? Or my dog, I'll take my dog for a walk, and I'm just walking down the road kind of casually. Meanwhile, she can sense an entire blueprint of urine throughout she can, wherever any dog has peed, right? She's being told a rich story of complexity and detail, right? Meanwhile, I'm oblivious, right? So we live in the same space, occupying different layers of reality. And this is true of life, right? Of our interpersonal relationships. Think about maybe a conversation you've had where you were in the same place as someone else, and yet it felt like you were living in very different realities, right? Maybe you felt like you were living in a reality of love, and they were occupying one of fear. Maybe the roles were reversed. But friends, our Umwelt is not just physical. It has an emotional quality to it, a spiritual quality. And last week, when we talked about cognitive biases, what we were really talking about is how we are often kept within the scope of our own Umwelt. But it's this understanding and maybe this capacity to have room for the fact that there is more than what we know. Or as Ed Yong says, the Umwelt tells us that all is not as it seems, and that everything we experience is but a filtered version of everything that we could experience. And yet so often we fail to actually live with that understanding. We fail to integrate that into our lives. Now, I think, to be fair, we can't actually move too far outside of our Umwelt when it comes to our sensory capacity, because I think even if we could, it would be overwhelming. Like, how many of us are overwhelmed with what we already perceive and sense, right? Like, life is overwhelming enough as it is as a human being. Okay, just me. Okay. All right. I mean... And so if we could imagine, or at least have this understanding that there is so much outside of our own perception, Might it make us more humble? Might it make us more curious? How many people have had experiences in your life that hinted that there was something outside of your Umwelt, right? Maybe something that you might consider supernatural, right? Maybe something that's hard to explain, right? And we all have these stories that we tell, especially with people we trust, about things that have happened in our life that remain a mystery to us, but they hint at something more. Personally, that was one of them. Right on cue. Personally, I wonder if when we have those experiences that we are not perceiving a glimpse of a reality that just lives beyond our normal spectrum of what we can perceive, right? Maybe what we call supernatural is something that science just doesn't have the ability to yet measure, right? Or maybe it was an experience of the natural, something that was humbling, an experience of nature, right? That gave you a scope of reality. Sometimes it's big moments in life, like death or birth, right? Moments that make you feel small, moments that hint to you that there is more than the reality that we know and that we are currently experiencing, where words like sacred and holy can be valuable, right? That those words can mean something. Or maybe it was a loss or a change or a disruption, right? That oftentimes our Umwelt is really, it's our comfort zone. It's the known. And certainly if it works, right, like if our Umwelt is working for us, then we don't necessarily have a reason to try to step beyond it. But for many of us, and it might be you out there, what you once believed, right, or a way that you once understood the world stopped working, right? Maybe it was through a loss, a change, a disruption, but either way, the way that things once worked for you didn't anymore. And so you were invited to move outside. I think about, the beginnings of my own faith journey in my early 20s when I was really beginning to evolve beyond the faith that I grew up in. I kind of call this time of my life the deconstruction. Maybe it was the deconstruction of my Umwelt as I had known it, right? And part of this was really aided by a film that I saw in my early 20s. A film called Samsara, and that's a Sanskrit word for the cycle of birth and death that we all kind of live in. And this is a film that was filmed in 25 countries over 5 years. And really what it is it showcases the diverse experiences that exist on this planet, all layered on top of one another. So it's really just mostly images of all of these things that are happening on the planet at the same time, occupying, in a sense, the same space, but are very different, right? And in some ways, it gives us just a broad view of life and of reality and of the layers of experience. It's quite a beautiful film. It's something that I do recommend. And what I loved about this film and what it helped me do is it helped me realize something. And I realized that, well, as a 20-year-old, white, male, Christian, born in America, and only ever lived in America, maybe there was something outside of my perspective. Maybe there was a world beyond what I had known, right? How many of us have moments like this where the cracks begin to form in our Umwelt, right? The lines begin to dissolve. The categories that were simple and neat do not work for us anymore, right? It can be a very disorienting experience. It can also be an exciting one, right? Maybe it's that experience that led you to a community like this. And maybe it's also what makes this community hard to describe sometimes, right? People are like, is it a church? Is it not a church? And you're like, well, can we talk about a spectrum? It's not so black and white. And when I think about the great teachers like Jesus, I think that it's teachers like Jesus that were inviting us to expand our perspective outside of our environment. I think about Jesus' most famous sermon, the Beatitudes, where he said things like, blessed are the meek, the poor, blessed are those who grieve. It was a reversal of how we so often view the spectrum of life, where we tend to think of the powerful and the rich and the complacent as those who are on the positive end of the spectrum. Jesus flipped it all the way around. He said, the last shall be first, right? Your view of the spectrum is completely different, right? So what are some other ways that we might apply spectrum thinking? Think about politics, for example, something that we have so locked in red and blue. And if we were to apply spectrum thinking to this, maybe it might mean a future system where we might think critically about what a person stands for and what their beliefs on unique issues are, rather than just defining them and lumping them into a category based on what colors they wear, right? What about religion? How often has religion been something of, what are you? What religion do you belong to? Versus being open to say, well, I lean towards, Christianity or Jesus in certain capacities, and in other capacities I lean towards Buddhism, and there's parts of my life where I'm a mystic, and what if we could open ourselves up to that level of spectrum? What kind of dialogue would open up between each other if we could? See, this makes room for a lot less judgment of others and really of ourself, right? There's a self-acceptance here. When we realize that whoever we are, it's going to be outside of someone's Umwelt, right? We're not going to all look the same and show up in the world the same. And we can recognize that one is not better than the other. We just are who we are, right? Recently, we had a tap and bottle event where some of us go and we do just we have a little discussion at Tap and Bottle, and I ordered a alcohol-removed white wine spritzer in a can. I'll say it again in case you're curious: an alcohol-removed white wine spritzer in a can. And I was thinking about that, and I was realizing, if there's a spectrum of macho-ness, I know that that wasn't the most possible macho drink I could have ordered, right? It's not the drink that you order and then drive off on a Harley Davidson. I understand that. But I've come in my life to understand that when I look at the spectrum of masculinity and femininity, and not even talking about gender, but just talking about these wonderful archetypes, right? And we can all realize we live in various places on this spectrum. It isn't black and white, and we can love where we sit. We can love where our range is, appreciating that every one of us is so much more complex than the categories we are often handed give us credit for. So we learn to appreciate ourselves, and at the same time, we learn to appreciate others. Now, the hard part is that it can be difficult when we realize that other people's growth and other people's journeys look very different than our own, right? And so often we think the goal is to get people to think like we do, to get people to be where we are spiritually, rather than to celebrate growth, movement, wherever and however it takes place. See, friends, we might look at certain aspects of the spectrum and think, oh, I'm 10 steps in this direction compared to this other person, right? But that isn't useful. What's useful is recognizing and appreciating and supporting their growth. That's where the power is. There are certainly going to be people in all our lives that maybe don't fully understand where we are in our spiritual journey. Maybe you feel more understood in some ways in this community than you do by some family and friends. Nonetheless, don't lose that ability to champion and celebrate those people in your lives experiencing growth in ways that might be different than yours, right? Even if you think of it as baby steps, right? Aren't baby steps the steps that we celebrate the most anyway, right? You're not celebrating this. It's like a baby makes steps, and that's when we Okay, moving on. Friends, if we can adjust our reality to include this type of thinking, spectrum thinking, right? We're going to realize that there's always going to be people to compare ourselves to on either side, right? There's always going to be someone who's wealthier than you, right? Who has more than you, right? Who has a better fill in the blank than you. And there's always going to be people on the other side as well, right? I think about myself, and I think on the one hand, I'm a pastor, and on the other hand, I'm kind of this is a very unique community. To some, it might be a little out there, right? And so it's fun for me because there are some people in my life who look at me and they look at the type of community this is, and they're like, Jake is out there. We lost Jake, right? Jake has gone off the map. And then there are other people where it's Jake's a pastor. He's the most square person I know, And for me, I just have fun with it at this point because it's you can accept who you are versus wishing you were someone else. So if we're always living on a spectrum, the question is, where do you want to put your focus? Do you want to wish that you had more, or that you were different, or that you lived in some other part of the spectrum? Or do you want to be grateful for where you are and who you are now? right? And what if our spiritual practices supported this, right? Like, what if, as we engage in our spiritual practices, we were really asking them to expand our Umwelt, expand our perspective? What if our prayers were prayers that really were asking for a greater appreciation of the spectrum of life, right? And when we engage in our spiritual practices to connect with whatever we consider God to be, maybe it was connecting to something that is beyond our perspective, inviting us to see more and experience more. As Eckhart Tolle says, the whole is made up of both the dark and the light. So as we perhaps see God in everything, we see God all along the spectrum, all throughout. So friends, may we check our reality with an appreciation for how massive it actually is and how little of it we experience with our senses. May we make space for others wherever they're at. And rather than comparing ourselves to those who might be on either side of the spectrum, right? May we just simply have gratitude for the gift of getting to be on the spectrum of life at all.